1996. Kabul fell, and the white flag of the Taliban rose over the presidential palace. Many Afghans felt a brief moment of relief. They hoped the decade of civil war was over, but a new nightmare began immediately. Streets, soccer stadiums, and dusty village squares transformed into execution grounds. This was not just a legal system. It was a calculated machine of terror designed to crush the will of 20 million people. The scars from this era remain visible today. Why did the people welcome them? The answer is simple. The country was already a graveyard. After the Soviet Union withdrew in 1989, Afghanistan collapsed into total anarchy. Warlords divided the map into private kingdoms. They fought over every highway, every grain silo, and every city block. Ordinary citizens lived in a permanent crossfire. Commanders kidnapped children for ransom. Armed gangs robbed travelers at every checkpoint. There were no courts, no police, and no safety. In this vacuum of power, a small movement emerged in the south near Kandahar. They called themselves the Taliban. The footage from that era shows young men in black turbans carrying Kalashnikovs. Most were orphans of the war against the Soviets. They had spent their lives in refugee camps across the border in Pakistan. Their education was limited to basic religious texts in rural schools. They did not promise democracy or progress. They promised three things: order, security, and absolute religious law. To a population starving and exhausted by constant murder, this deal seemed acceptable. But this was only the beginning. The Taliban moved fast. They didn't just fight, they cleared the roads and disarmed the local gangs. They hanged kidnappers from tank barrels. To the merchant and the farmer, the violence seemed to be ending. At first glance, a liberation. But in reality, a total takeover. The sound of music disappeared from the air. Radios were smashed. Television sets were hung from trees with wire. The Taliban began to implement a version of law that the world had never seen in the modern age. Events accelerated. There was no turning back. The first public executions began shortly after. This was the price of their order. Thus, the foundation of the first Islamic Emirate was laid. 1994. The Taliban took Kandahar with almost no resistance. They moved across the desert in white pickup trucks. They disarmed rival factions, seized stockpiles of Soviet weapons, and executed anyone who resisted. Their rise was not a political shift. It was a violent takeover built on systemic fear. Commander after commander surrendered or fled across the border. By September 26, 1996, the Taliban reached the gates of Kabul. The capital was already a ruin. Years of heavy shelling and mass starvation had broken the population. But the new rulers wanted to send a message. They needed a symbol of the old world to destroy. Their first target was Dr. Mohammad Najibullah. He was the former president of Afghanistan. Since 1992, Najibullah had lived inside a United Nations compound. He believed international law and the blue flag offered him safety. He was wrong. The Taliban ignored all diplomatic protocols. They smashed through the compound gates and dragged Najibullah into the street. The footage from those days shows no mercy. They beat him with rifle butts and tortured him. Then they castrated him. Finally, they shot him in the head. His brother was executed right next to him. The violence did not stop at death. The Taliban transported the bodies to a public square in central Kabul. They hung Najibullah from a traffic light post for the entire city to see. They stuffed cigarettes and crumpled banknotes into his dead mouth. It was a visual mockery of his perceived corruption. The bodies remained there for 2 days. This was the signal. The era of the Republic was over. The era of the Taliban had begun. There was no turning back. 1996. The Taliban seized power and dismantled the existing legal system within weeks. They established a network of Islamic courts across every province. These courts operated without defense lawyers. There were no written legal codes for citizens to reference. There was no process for appeals. Taliban clerics acted as judges. They answered only to the high leadership in Kandahar. Trials lasted minutes. Sentences were carried out the same afternoon. There was no defense. There was no debate. But this was only the beginning. The regime targeted the senses. Music was declared a crime. Television sets were confiscated. Movie theaters were shuttered. Photography of living beings was prohibited. Even kite flying, a national pastime, became illegal. The sound of the country changed. Weddings became silent affairs. Radios were smashed with hammers in the streets. The footage shows piles of broken electronics and tangled magnetic tape hanging from trees. The social structure collapsed for half the population. Every girls' school in the country closed its doors. Women were banned from all offices and shops. They were ordered to wear the full burqa. No skin could show. Men were forced to grow beards to a specific length. Those who used a razor faced immediate imprisonment or public beatings. Where did the enforcement come from? The Ministry for the Promotion of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice. Their patrols moved through the cities in pickup trucks. They carried whips and wooden sticks. They stopped civilians to inspect their clothing, their grooming, and their gait. Public punishment became a primary tool of governance. It served as a visible warning to the population. The Ghazi Stadium in Kabul became the center of this system. It was no longer a place for athletes. It was a stage for state violence. 1998. Journalist Jason Burke entered the stadium to record the proceedings. The stands were full. The grass was green. Two men accused of theft were led to the center of the field. The camera records a strange detail. Doctors were present. They did not arrive to provide medical care. Their job was to ensure the surgical precision of the punishment. They monitored the prisoners as one hand and one foot were severed from each man. Blood pooled on the turf. Thousands of spectators watched from the concrete tiers. No one cheered. No one protested. After the amputations, the two men were dragged outside the stadium gates. They were executed with rifles. When the bodies were removed, the crowd was ordered to disperse. The gates were locked. Later that week, the stadium hosted a soccer match. The blood had been washed away, but the message remained. The Taliban called this qisas. At first glance, it was an ancient law of retaliation. But in reality, it was the total erasure of human dignity. Attendance was not optional. Families brought their children to the front rows. Refusing to watch drew the attention of the secret police. Suspicion meant a trip to the stadium the following Friday. The images stayed with the children. The era of fear had arrived. 1996. This year marked the beginning of a total social transformation. Between 1996 and 1999, the Taliban enforced their specific version of Sharia law across the majority of Afghanistan. The legal system was simple and brutal. Crimes were defined broadly. Theft of any kind resulted in the immediate amputation of a hand or a foot. The courts ignored context. There were no investigations into poverty, famine, or the possibility of false accusations. A single witness statement was enough to cost a man his limb or his life. The sound of surgical saws became a reality in city squares. Why did the Taliban use such extreme violence? It was a tool of absolute psychological dominance. Fear was the primary method of governance. Adultery and premarital relationships were classified as capital offenses. The Taliban treated rumors of immoral behavior as proven facts. No evidence was required. Men and women accused of these acts faced public execution. They were often stoned to death or shot at close range. Public squares became theater stages. Afghan officials and international observers later confirmed that between 1996 and 2001, these events were regular occurrences. The Taliban announced the dates and times in advance. They wanted a full audience. November 1999. Ghazi Stadium in Kabul was packed with thousands of people. The footage shows a woman in a blue burqa. She is forced to kneel on the grass in the center of the field. A Taliban guard approaches her from behind. He racks around into the chamber of his rifle. He fires one shot into her head. The crowd watched in silence. This specific execution was filmed and smuggled out of the country. It sparked global outrage. But for the Taliban leadership, this was not a PR disaster. It was a demonstration of strength. It reinforced their image of total control. The religious police monitored every movement. Women faced public beatings if their burqa was lifted too high while walking. But beatings were only the baseline. Stoning became the most feared penalty for social transgressions. Events escalated further. The Taliban revived punishments that horrified even those who had survived decades of war. Being buried alive became a reality. February 1998. Mullah Muhammad Omar personally issued a specific execution order. 3 men were accused of homosexuality. Their sentence was to be crushed by a wall. The process was methodical. The men were forced into a pit. Workers stacked bricks to create a heavy wall directly above them. The plan was for the wall to collapse and bury them under hundreds of pounds of debris. A timer was set. The Taliban promised that if the men survived for 30 minutes under the rubble, they would be allowed to live. The wall fell. The dust settled. Against all odds, the men were still breathing when the 30 minutes expired. They were pulled from the wreckage and rushed to a hospital. Their survival was a mechanical failure, not an act of mercy. Taliban judges defended these methods in public statements. They offered only 2 choices for those they deemed immoral: death by stoning or death by crushing. There was no legal defense. There was no consideration for age, consent, or mental health. The goal was the total erasure of the individual. The regime used these spectacles to turn the entire population into silent witnesses. Thus, the law became a weapon. 3 distinct categories: criminals, political rivals, moral offenders. To the Taliban, there was no difference. All were classified as enemies of the state. Small infractions led to lethal outcomes. Women faced the harshest reality. Adultery was a flexible charge. A woman spoke to a man in the street. A woman walked outside without a male relative. These were enough for a death sentence. Many were punished for acts that were legal in every other country on earth. Education became a criminal offense. Across the country, schools for girls were shuttered. The buildings stood empty. Those who defied the ban were beaten. Girls who attended secret classes faced public flogging. The objective was clear. Women were to be invisible and silent. How did the average citizen survive? They didn't. People lived in constant fear. A neighbor's grudge was a weapon. One false accusation of theft or immorality meant a person disappeared. The legal process was a machine. Trials lasted minutes. There were no lawyers and no defense. Religious judges sat in short robes and delivered oral verdicts. No written charges were filed. Punishments were announced over loudspeakers to the city. There was no appeal process for the condemned. The footage from the era is grainy. It shows men being led to the center of a sports stadium. The sound of a single shot rings out. Executioners carried out the killings on the same day as the verdict. Everything changed in late 2001. Following the September 11th attacks, the United States invaded. The Taliban's grip on Kabul shattered in weeks. The retreat was sudden. Fighters abandoned government offices, courts, and prison blocks overnight. The public executions in the stadium ended. This wasn't a change of heart. It was a loss of territory. At first glance, a liberation, but in reality, a regrouping. Many Afghans believed the 5-year nightmare was over. They were wrong. The Taliban did not vanish. They withdrew into the rural villages and the mountain passes. The war was only changing shape. Thus ended the first era of their rule. They crossed the border. In the mountains of Pakistan, the regrouping began. This was the start of a quiet war that would last 18 years. The Taliban changed their strategy. They avoided large cities and open battles. They turned to tactics that were harder to track. They operated under the cover of darkness. They planted roadside bombs on supply routes. They targeted anyone suspected of supporting the new Afghan government or foreign military forces. The violence became invisible to the international press, but on the ground, the body count rose. The Taliban enforced their own version of justice in rural areas where the central government had no reach. Entire districts began to fall. Helmand, Kandahar, Uruzgan, Ghazni. These provinces slowly slipped back under insurgent control. In these regions, the Taliban acted as the supreme authority. They decided who lived and who died. Human rights groups identified a specific system: shadow courts. These were not official buildings. These courts operated in village mosques or private basements. The footage from this era is scarce, but the reports are consistent. There were no written records, there were no defense lawyers, no witnesses were allowed to speak in favor of the accused. But who were the targets? Anyone the Taliban deemed a threat. Teachers, aid workers, police informants. People were dragged from their homes in the middle of the night. Many disappeared forever. Families waited for news that never came. They were too afraid to ask questions to the local commanders. In some cases, the result was visible. A body left on a dusty roadside. In other cases, there was only silence. Rumors passed between neighbors in low voices. The punishments were designed to be hidden, but some were meant to send a message. 2010. One specific case reached the international media. In Kunduz province, Taliban fighters gathered a crowd. They publicly stoned a young man and a young woman. The charge was adultery. The couple had tried to flee to escape a forced marriage. They were caught at a checkpoint and brought before a shadow judge. The sentence was carried out immediately. No appeals were possible. This was not just a punishment, it was a signal to the entire province. The Taliban were back. Their laws were the only laws that mattered. The government in Kabul could do nothing to stop it. The cycle of fear was restored. 400 people. That was the size of the crowd ordered to watch the execution. The villagers stood in a circle. Stones were thrown until the woman stopped moving. She died in the dirt. The man survived the stoning but did not escape. He was beaten with heavy cables until he lost consciousness. This was not an isolated act of violence. It was a calculated message. The Taliban wanted to prove that their methods from the 1990s had never changed. Even without a seat in the capital, they maintained a parallel system of terror. They were willing to kill. They were able to punish. As the years passed, the dynamic shifted. Foreign forces began drafting withdrawal plans. The Taliban watched the calendar. Their violence became more frequent and more public. 2014. This was the turning point. As international troops packed their equipment, the insurgents moved into the light. In Helmand province, they seized 5 men. The accusation was kidnapping. The venue was an open-air opium market. The footage shows the scene. Farmers and traders are forced into a line. 5 ropes are thrown over a beam. The Taliban hanged all 5 men in front of the crowd. The bodies remained there until the next morning. This was a deliberate display. It was a signal to the local population about who held the real power in the province. Taliban leaders released a statement. The executions were intended to instill fear. They called it a deterrent. For ordinary Afghans, the psychological weight was crushing. Rural districts became silent zones. No one dared to speak. People avoided the main roads. They bypassed the checkpoints. They stopped talking to strangers in the bazaars. The risk was total. At any moment, a fighter could point a finger. An accusation of helping the government or foreign forces was a death sentence. No evidence was required. No trial was held. The result was a wave of internal displacement. Families fled their homes under the cover of darkness. They left their crops, their livestock, and their history behind. They chose poverty over the gallows. The message was received. The Taliban were back. August 15, 2021. This date changed everything. The Taliban entered Kabul as the final foreign transport planes left the tarmac. The Afghan government did not fight. It collapsed in less than 72 hours. Taliban leaders appeared on television screens across the nation. They spoke of a general amnesty. They promised safety for former soldiers, police officers, and judges. Why did the people flee to the airport? It seemed the leadership promised peace, but the memory of the 90s was stronger than any televised speech. The footage shows the reality. Fighters did not wait for official orders. They began house-to-house searches in every major district. They carried lists of names. They checked ID cards at every checkpoint. It wasn't just a transition, it was a systematic purge of the old guard. The sound of heavy boots on stairs became a death sentence. Former soldiers disappeared from their homes at night. Young men were loaded into pickup trucks for questioning. Many never returned. In the following weeks, farmers found bodies dumped in irrigation ditches and open fields. At first glance, a new, modern government. But in reality, the old machine was returning. The movement began rebuilding the exact infrastructure they used decades ago. By the end of 2021, the religious police were back on the streets. They established a new Supreme Court. Every seat was filled by male clerics loyal to the movement. There were no lawyers. There were no defense motions. These courts ignored international law entirely. They operated on a strict medieval interpretation of religious codes. Evidence was secondary to the word of a cleric. The system was designed for speed, not for justice. Events accelerated. By 2022, the prisons were full again. Cells originally built for insurgents now held former government clerks and activists. The walls were the same. Only the prisoners had changed. There was no turning back. The new authorities focused on the provinces first. In rural areas, the executions were public. They served as a signal to anyone thinking of resistance. No one dared to protest. No one dared to speak. The camera records the silence of the city streets. Kabul became a city of closed doors and whispered warnings. The transition was complete. The era of the Republic was over.